Good morning and welcome everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started right at 10 o'clock. So thank you for joining us. We will continue to allow people, watch the waiting room and allow people to enter. My name is Amy Jacobson and I'm the Executive Director for Prairie Action ND. We are a communications and digital advocacy organization that focuses on lifting up and amplifying progressive values and progressive voices in the state of North Dakota. We are thrilled to be working in coalition with Planned Parenthood, the North Dakota Women's Network, ACLU, the North Dakota Wind Fund, and the Red River Women's Clinic to bring you today's panel. It's North Dakota Access to Abortion, the laws, the lawsuits, and the legislature. We have an amazing, phenomenal panel here to bring you a whole bunch of information. But before we do start, I did want to start with a little bit of housekeeping, just a few things to keep in mind as we move through this next hour. First, I would ask everybody to remain on mute so that we can have our speakers be heard clearly by all participants. We would love for you to have your cameras on if you like, but do not feel like you need to be doing that. Our speakers, there are 6 of us today. We will all be highlighted or spotlighted, so you'll be able to see clearly who's speaking. We do encourage the chat to be a very lively place, so please do put any questions, comments, references. We will be dropping links in there to action alerts and events and other items and like that throughout the duration of the hour. So please do that there. I will do my best to monitor the chat. If we do have any time towards the end of our hour, I will pull forward any questions for our panelists to ask at that time. There's a new thing that's been happening on Zooms where a lot of people or some people may have AIs that help them take notes. We are not going to be allowing that today. So we will be booting out any AIs. I don't think that should interrupt your ability to be here today, but I just wanted to make that message for everybody. And then I think that's all of the housekeeping. So again, thank you for making time for us in this pop-up event that just came very swiftly to you all. You should know that we had 86 people register to be here today, and that's with just putting this event out on Wednesday. So we know that you all are in desperate need of information and community around reproductive rights in North Dakota. Since the overturning of Roe v. Wade, it's been a pretty dark place in our country for reproductive rights, and particularly in a state like North Dakota. We had Red River Women's Clinic, our only abortion provider in the state for decades, be forced to move across the river into Minnesota. But it was not without an outpouring of support from people like you that helped make that happen. They are now in a beautiful clinic. They actually have an open house for their employees and previous employees today. And why Tammy Kromer-Nacker is not able to be with us here today. But I think also why we're here today is because throughout that darkness, there have been some points of light, and that happened last week with the North Dakota Supreme Court issuing a favorable ruling. And we have one of the attorneys here to talk with us today about that ruling, but also want to drill in on the fact that abortion anti-choice advocates are continuing to push abortion bans at the legislature. And so we do have some of our local advocates to talk about what those anti-choice legislators and advocates have been saying, how they've been using this moment in time to cause confusion, chaos, and to promote misinformation, and I'll say straight up lies to folks about what their bills mean and what they mean for people in North Dakota who need access to abortion. We have a whole host of great information for you today. And so with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker today is Meetra Mehdizadeh, and she's an attorney with the Center for Reproductive Rights. Meetra has worked for this center for since 2021 and assists in litigating reproductive rights cases in the United States. Before joining CRR, Meetra worked at the New York City Commission on Human Rights, where she enforced the New York City's anti-discrimination law, and at Children's Rights, where she brought cases on behalf of children in state custody. We are thrilled to have her here with us today to talk about the most recent ruling by the North Dakota Supreme Court. And I also want to extend a big thank you because I understand that you are taking some very well-earned time off and are still being here with us today and sharing this time. So thank you for that, Meetra.
Thank you, Amy, and I'm happy to be here. I'm actually back from vacation, but thrilled to be with you all and to be talking about this morning. I should acknowledge that one of my co-panelists, Christina Sambor, is also on this case. So also a fantastic partner and glad to be working with fantastic partners in North Dakota. So as Amy said, I'm an attorney at the Center for Reproductive Rights in New York. I'm one of the folks representing Red River Women's Clinic in its challenge to the trigger ban, as well as other ongoing cases. So I'm going to talk a bit today about the decision we got last week regarding the trigger ban. But first, I thought it'd be helpful to give some background on what the law is and how we got here. So North Dakota is one of about a dozen states that had a trigger ban in place before Dobbs. And so these are laws that were designed to take effect if Roe were ever overturned and states could prohibit abortion. So North Dakota's law was passed in 2007, and it's actually one of the more extreme bans, even among the many state bans, because most laws have some exceptions to say in certain situations, it would not be a crime to provide an abortion. And we know from other states' experiences that even where those exceptions exist, there's often a lot of challenges with actually getting that care. But North Dakota's trigger ban doesn't even have any exceptions. It says in all circumstances, it is a crime to provide an abortion. And if the state prosecutes a person, they can raise certain defenses in their criminal prosecution to say that, the abortion was necessary to save the patient's life, or it was ending a pregnancy due to rape or incest. But, they're still at risk of prosecution if they provide any abortions. So obviously a very frightening law that would have a huge impact, not only on abortion clinics, but also on hospitals and OBGYNs when people come in with regular pregnancy complications, which we know happen all the time, or when people are having obstetric emergencies. And so there were real concerns in North Dakota and elsewhere about how some of these laws are going to affect people who are trying to get care in an emergency. So we challenged this law back in July under the North Dakota State Constitution. The North Dakota State Constitution has broad protections for individual rights, some protections which are not in the US Constitution. And so in particular, it has protections for the right to life, liberty, safety, and happiness. Other state Supreme Courts have found that very similar language protects a right to bodily autonomy or personal autonomy, which includes a right to make decisions about getting an abortion. So, for example, that's very similar to the language in Kansas, which the Kansas Supreme Court relied on to find a right to abortion. And so we thought that the North Dakota Supreme Court should interpret its similar language similarly to protect abortion rights. And the law was blocked relatively quickly by the trial court. So this ban has never been in effect in North Dakota, thankfully. But shortly after the trial court decided to block the law, the Attorney General's office asked the Supreme Court to lift that court order and to let them enforce the law. And the reason they said they should be allowed to enforce it was they thought that we had not shown that we, the plaintiffs, are likely to be able to show that the North Dakota State Constitution protects any right to abortion. And so that's what we were arguing before the North Dakota Supreme Court. And in last week's decision, the North Dakota Supreme Court found that there is a fundamental right to get an abortion, at least in situations where a person's life or health is at risk. And that is protected by the constitutional protections for life and safety. So the majority opinion in that case relied very heavily on the history of abortion regulation in North Dakota and looked to the fact that until 2007, when the trigger law was passed, North Dakota has never prohibited abortion in cases where a person's life is at risk. And it has previous state laws and bans have always recognized that there is some right, at least where a person's life is at risk, to get an abortion. They also looked at medical journals from the time and what people understood about abortion care around the time of statehood. And they found that people had an understanding that there are medical situations where abortion is the standard of care and where it's necessary to provide an abortion to save a person's life or preserve their health. It's incredibly gratifying the way they've kind of looked in the opinion, not just at the law and the legal history, but also at what this law would mean for people on the ground. So they look both, like I said, at medical journals from the time, but also at some more recent court decisions that have had to grapple with what this means for emergency care. So there's a lengthy citation to an opinion from a federal court in Idaho, which looked at how abortion bans would put physicians in hospitals and dealing with emergency situations in this incredibly difficult position where they have to make a split-second decision between doing something that could be considered a felony or letting their patient experience real risks of conditions like sepsis or hemorrhage or even death, and potentially experience life-limiting disabilities because they were delayed or denied care when that is the standard of care, and that is how doctors have been trained to treat those patients. This court noted in its opinion that the ban does not even have exceptions for ectopic pregnancies, which are non-viable and potentially life-threatening. So again, it's just gratifying to see a court really trying to understand what a law means and how it is going to heavily impact people and have that, terrible impact on people's ability to exercise their rights to life and to safety, because we really tried to emphasize that in our briefing and at argument to show how extreme this law is and the kind of devastating impact that it would have. And so it's a relief to see that the court seems to have understood that and that they took that to heart. And they are persuaded by the impact that the law would have on folks. So 3 members of the court also wrote separately just to highlight how the North Dakota Constitution does have broader protections than the federal Constitution and that it is more protective of individual rights. So that was also very gratifying to see that this additional language in the North Dakota Constitution is, getting the broad interpretation that I think it was intended to have, and that it will hopefully provide a good foundation for other cases involving challenges to laws that restrict people's life and liberty. Of course, this decision really focused on health and life risks to people. We know there are other reasons that people seek abortion care, which were not dealt with in this opinion, but we are very excited that this is at least a good foundation and will preserve access to care, hopefully at least in some of those very serious circumstances. The case is not over. So this is all about blocking the law while the case continues. And so there will be future updates in the case, but for now we are relieved that the law will remain blocked and that abortion will remain legal with significant restrictions that were already in place, but at least without a total ban in effect.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that information, Meetra. I think that a lot of us folks out here in the state were just really curious to have a comprehensive understanding of what that really means. And I think that you laid the groundwork for us very well. And it leads us into a good part of the next conversation, which is around what's happening at the North Dakota legislature right now. So I'm going to now introduce Kayla Schmidt. Kayla is the interim executive director at the North Dakota Women's Network. She's originally from Minot. She lives in Bismarck. She says because she likes to be in the middle of things. Kayla started her work in activism during college and an internship at Planned Parenthood, where she organized efforts around opposing the 2014 personhood ballot measure, which I think most of you are familiar with. It was defeated at that time. She then earned her MA in creative writing, worked for several nonprofits, emceed reproductive rights rallies, joined her local roller derby team, and honed her skills as a cool aunt and continues to be a community advocate and all-around rabble rouser. We are always really happy to have Kayla in the room with us. We think you bring a terrific energy, and we are looking forward to hearing what you have to say about the North Dakota legislature.
What don't I have to say about the North Dakota legislature? Plenty. So previously on SB 2150, so this is our major abortion-related bill this session. So it was introduced by Senators Myrdal, Boehm, and Lueck, and Representatives Porter, Rohr, and Ruby. So in case you haven't had a chance to keep up, I'm going to go over a quick, how did we get here? Where are we now? So it was first heard in the Senate Judiciary Committee, which happens to be Myrdal's committee. That was on January 16th. There's a couple work on some amendments, and it was given a due pass recommendation. It passed the Senate on January 31st with 43 yays and 4 nays. Those 4 were Braunberger, Hogan, Lee, and Pipecorn. Then, after past the Senate, goes to the House where it has another committee hearing. This time it was in House Human Services, and that was on March 14th. And then, as we just heard, the Supreme Court ruling on the trigger ban was released March 17th. So we haven't heard a recommendation yet from that committee as far as how they want the House to vote. Most likely they're looking at the language that is being used to see what kind of amendments and little things they can work on. So most likely whatever version is ultimately decided on, we expect it will probably be passed by the House. Then being the version might be a little bit different from the one in the Senate, that goes to something called conference committee, which is when both groups come together, they take a little look at what version each side passed, compare them, come up with what they can agree on, and then it will ultimately go to be signed. So that's kind of the feeling we have coming up. So we are paying really close attention to the language that's being used as the people who are putting this bill forward are presenting it. So as soon as Senator Myrdal brings up 2150, she'll say it's not a discussion or a debate on how you feel about abortion. This is just to clear up what's already on the books. We're just doing a clarification. We're just making sure that everybody's on the same page. They have Christopher Dodson with the Catholic Conference. His testimony refers to all the superfluous language. They really talk about how they've worked with so many legislators and life groups in the state to make the language more concise. And it required so much work. They never mention working with anybody who does patient care or is a victim advocate or actual doctors who work in this industry or anything else. It was really kind of a one-sided discussion on how these came to be. But a lot of the issue is on how they're just using this kind of disingenuous, we're just simplifying things. And as we've heard, an oversimplification of a complicated issue is not very good lawmaking. It does not account for all the issues that could occur. So with a strategy when it comes to testifying on 2150, on the Senate side, when we had our hearing, a lot of doctors showed up and they actually testified in support of 2150, but offered many amendments. So they were supporting the parts that, as we kind of talked about the affirmative defenses with the trigger ban and everything. So with 2150, they allowed for the removal of affirmative defense, but now there's just these exceptions, just a very slim definition of exceptions. One of those being the ectopic pregnancies, which we hear a lot about, but there's so many other issues that people might not be aware of. So the doctor said, yes, we like what you're kind of doing with this. This will allow us to practice, but they also requested amendments, including some language that care could be provided to prevent death or substantial and irreversible physical impairment. They wanted that and to an or. And then throughout the law, the word post-fertilization was used. And again, when we're talking about language that affects people's healthcare, we want to be accurate. And so one of the doctors said, we do not use this language. We prefer gestational age, which is the standard in medical care communities. So that was a request they made. They also wanted additional exceptions for lethal fetal anomalies. And in the case that someone becomes pregnant due to rape or incest, there's a 6-week cutoff. So they wanted, one of the doctors said, many women do not know they are pregnant until well after 6 weeks gestational age, and victims of sexual trauma tend not to present to care until a later time. So then you can watch all this video online as well. In the committee work, they brought back Christopher Dodson, again with the Catholic Conference, and Courtney Copley of the Medical Association. And Dotson said, well, the doctors only raised 2 issues and we fixed them. So the amendments they gave did change that and to or in that first one. They did give us the gestational age, so it is medical language, but it still excluded those last 2 amendments that they were asking for. In this discussion, they didn't bring up any consideration of any of the testimony for opposition. In fact, it was referred to as moot, given that the doctors were like, we support, which it was, politics tactics. And any proposed amendments by committee members were not included either. So going back to kind of what we're seeing with the language that they're using when giving us these bills, you see a lot of hypocrisy. I don't know, I'm going to start bringing a kazoo, and every time they say something and then say something else again, I might just like do that. I don't know. So because Meetra will say, this isn't about whether you're pro-choice or pro-life. And then Senator Boehm came up and said, this is the first bill I'm testifying on, and it's interesting that it's pro-life. And so she'll say, it's not about this. And then immediately somebody will say, here's why I'm here to testify. So they'll say that when Roe was overturned, it was just a lot of unnecessary fear mongering from media and all these activists. But then when I believe it was Senator Braunberger said, well, what about the future of our state? Won't this affect doctors who want to work here? Meryl said that, well, Minnesota welcomes doctors who want to take the life of young children and maim women. So I'm not sure where the fear mongering kind of accusations come from. But a lot of this too, the legislative session is really focused on building that workforce and how do we attract people to our state. The argument on the other side is that things like 2150 will help. Again, these are actual quotes, because more life and life comes forth. So they're not actually saying, well, we're restricting people's ability to create their own healthcare decisions. So more children mean you're just born to work in North Dakota. It's very dystopian, and again, very reductive of people and making their own choices. Again, when they talk about protecting women and families, but we know we've seen other laws where we haven't supported any of the bills about providing childcare, paid family leave, minimum wage. So we're seeing kind of 2 stories play forth. And again, with this deceptive language and shutting down all communication by saying it's not about this, it's about this. We're seeing this in lots of other bills as well. So the end goal is they just really want to punish people who don't look or act or believe or worship or are the exact same thing that they want. Christina, we'll hear from later, did a really great job on some of the LGBTQ and very anti-trans bills about actually calling them out when they say some of these things, like we're just defining words, where instead of defining things, they're actually coding for discrimination. And so they're doing this thing where we were saying this, but they are meaning something else. And so I think a lot of our groups are doing a really good job about calling people out when they do this. A lot of these bills are tied to one another. So while this one is distinctly about abortion, we also know that it's about information. So we have these sex education ones again, where Meetra has put forth that you have to have this ultrasound video, but that's disinformation. But meanwhile, we have these book bans that would help with, they're usually talking about sex education books, which is just banning information. So there's a lot of back and forth. A lot of these things are tied together. So I think, especially in the session, it's been really good to see lots of different groups come together and try and help each other, because we can see what's happening behind the scenes. And while we get some really good quotes on camera, I don't even want to know what kind of things are being said when they're not on camera. So just something to keep an ear out and an eye out when you're looking at what people are providing in testimony. When you're providing testimony, is say exactly what you mean and exactly what these things do. So much of the danger in some of these bills is, again, that they're saying like, it's okay, it's just a little bit of this, but we know that it has real world implications and it affects people's healthcare and our rights, essentially. So that is where we are with 2150. That's what I got.
Well, thank you, Kayla, very much for giving us that update on that bill. And I think I want to amplify and lift up some of those concerns that you did stress, because What is very clear, excuse me, is that the anti-choice advocates, including Senator Yana Myrtle and the Catholic Conference lobbyist Christopher Dodson, are intentionally misleading policymakers as to what the current lay of the land is when it comes to abortion, what their Bill 2150 means, and the way that they would shut down any conversation by saying this is not a place to debate abortion when presenting an abortion ban. And we also, so thank you for lifting that up. I think it's very important that people know there's a lot of intentional misinformation that is happening. To even be, as far as saying that there really was no oppositional testimony, right? So thank you for sharing that. I think that's an important thing for people to be keeping in mind when they're looking and hearing from these anti-choice people who are really changing the laws in North Dakota. I'm going to move now, speaking of this bill, and there's some very real impacts that, 2150 will have on people, especially because of the no real exceptions that lie within the bill. And so I'm actually going to move over to a conversation we're going to have with Becky Matthews. I think many of you are very familiar with Becky. Becky is a community advocate and a powerful voice for change in North Dakota, from her work in early childhood interventions to her time serving on the boards in her roles at the Share Pregnancy and Infant Loss Support Chapter and the North Dakota Women's Network. Becky leads with passion and with heart. For 16 years, she's been sharing her personal story and connecting with people across North Dakota and across the country as a defender of reproductive rights. So thank you, Becky, for making time for us this morning.
Yes, good morning. My advocacy started with my own personal story of in 2007, during my third pregnancy, finding out we were expecting identical twins. That was the last good news of that pregnancy. And at that time, needing to go to one of 13 centers in the United States, which was, we chose to go to Cincinnati, and finding out we had many diagnoses, not only twin-to-twin transfusion syndrome, where they shared a placenta, but we also had developmental cord insertion, a pulmonary valve stenosis, and placental share. I start saying those words in front of legislators, and their eyes glaze over because, dear God, they don't know what any of that means, but they sure want to make decisions for me. So through that week of being there, they gave us some options for my husband and I to decide on. The team told us to go back to our room and talk about if we wanted to try bed rest and get to viability. I was at the beginning of that week, right at the beginning of 19 weeks. If we wanted to do a laser surgery on the placenta to kind of separate what was connecting the two twins, because if one died, it would affect the other twin. Or the last option was to terminate one twin to save the other. We decided to try bed rest and go week by week, and had our own kind of standard of how we were going to make decisions. And came home on a flight at 19 plus weeks. And that is very important because I would be the 20-week ban. And we are still waiting for amniocentesis results. So a 20-week ban would very much have impacted my husband's and mine and our higher power and our medical team's decision-making, and rushed it. And I'm here 15 years later, 16 years later, to say that I've never been uncomfortable with the decision we made at that time, because we were able to set the parameters of the decision we made. Sadly, we came home and we lost both twins. We did not have any other decisions to make, but never have I regretted the decisions we made, because they were on our time frame, under our decisions. Roll around to 2013, and we had thousands of abortion bans, many of which we're dealing with today. And I decided to speak up. And funny thing is, today, 10 years ago, we were at the Capitol. I see Dina Butcher on here. Her and I were at the Capitol for Stand Up for Women rally, because we were sick and tired of all the abortion bullshit. I'll just be completely honest. And so since then, I've heard a lot of women's stories, from being at support groups for women that have pregnancy loss, people whispering to me in corners like I terminated a baby, but don't tell anyone. To I have a baby, but I terminated their twin. Because when you find out you have a fatal anomaly, you really have three choices. One is to carry that baby to term. One is to get induced early and deliver that baby, which in North Dakota, they used to be able to do. Now you have to go to Minneapolis to do that. And the third is to have a D&E. All are appropriate, all are okay, all are up to the parents with their higher power, with their medical team to decide. Because any of those choices are hell. And so you think that you're sitting at a legislative table and can tell a woman what their choice is bullshit, again, of the mental anguish. We want to talk about physical health and death and all this, but we don't enter into the realm of mental health. Imagine walking into a grocery store every time when you are 34 weeks pregnant getting asked, oh, when are you due? Is it a boy or a girl? Oh, da, 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 da. And all you can think is my baby's going to seize to death when they're born. My baby might not make it through delivery. So this is the discussions that no one wants to have about the gray of abortion, the gray of late-term abortion, and the mental and physical health. I also want to touch on that being pregnant is a high-risk condition. My very first friend in life, ironically, died in 2013 while I was testifying on all these bills during her third trimester because of a pulmonary embolism. Pregnancy is high risk for women, and just saying, just carry it to term, it's no big deal, is a lie. So here we are again in 2023 fighting this. And I can say to Kayla's point, I testified in 2150, and Senator Larson said, well, really, you're testifying for this with the amendment for fatal anomaly that they never put in. So they are gaslighting everyone. They're gaslighting everyone. So please use my story if you're talking to someone who doesn't see the gray of abortion rights and late-term abortions. Please use my story and others like it to say this is why this is medical care. And you can tell I'm passionate and gets me fired up, right?
Becky, thank you for always being willing to share your story, because your voice is not just one voice. Your story is so many people's stories. So thank you for sharing that. And also, you know, we want to be very firm in the fact it was like you were being gaslit and testifiers were being gaslit by legislators. We are firmly against abortion bans. Pregnancy is complicated. We do not need our medical care dictated by the legislature. And also there's this they seem to think that there's a big disconnect too between people's physical experiences and their mental health, right? So there's no exceptions. It's a very dangerous place for pregnant people to be in if this bill is passed. So thank you for sharing that with us. And now we're going to actually go over and hear a little bit from Christina Sanborn. Oh, I have to pull up, sorry, I have an auto order here. Christina, sorry, guys, Christina is a licensed attorney here in North Dakota who's committed to providing holistic representation for her clients through zealous advocacy and trauma-informed support. She also provides consulting services to a whole lot of nonprofits and social change leaders here in the state. This legislative session, you can see and hear her talent and her passion for her hard work defending reproductive rights and LGBTQ rights at the legislature. And I would say you all might want to do yourself a favor and look up the North Dakota Human Rights Coalition's TikTok after this call to see Christina in action, where she really schools some legislators on truth and transparency, which we're not seeing a lot of when it comes to these issues. So Christina, please.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, so I mean, I think just to touch on a couple of points made earlier this morning, and I apologize in advance if you hear some squealing in the background. My 16-month-old is having a morning, so I do want to echo the encouragement to everyone listening. If you are reaching out to legislators, if you are advocating on behalf of whatever group you're advocating on this session, not to be convinced that they know better than you do what you want, what you need, what you're advocating for, because we're just seeing a lot of that, and it's really disturbing to kind of, I ended up using the term gaslighting in testimony because that's exactly what it is, to say, well, we're just trying to make sure the definitions are clear and that we know what we're doing. And it's like, no, if that results in you defining out of existence a group of people, then that's not just what you're doing something that is extremely dangerous and very concerning. So I just want to encourage everybody that if you're having conversations with your legislators, to stand your ground and not be told that you're misunderstanding what's going on, because we've just increasingly heard that as the session's gone on, that it's not this. And why, the other thing that has come up in increasing weeks is why is everyone assuming that these laws, everything's about gay people, everything's about trans people? Why is there this assumption? And so just to be ready for that. So anyway, that's just my little aside. So in terms of 2150, a couple of things. So one, we've already kind of discussed that the only exception, quote unquote, in the law for rape and incest, I'll just read you the language here, that applies specifically to situations of rape or incest. And so it says, this section, so the section that defines what an abortion is, does not apply to an abortion to terminate a pregnancy that, based on reasonable medical judgment, resulted from gross sexual imposition, which is the term for rape essentially in our century code, gross sexual imposition, sexual abuse of a ward, or incest, as those offenses are defined in chapter 12.120, if the probable gestational age of the unborn child is 6 weeks or less. So the other thing I want to highlight, and I think this is particularly interesting in light of what the recent Supreme Court ruling said and what Meetra told us about that today. So the other exception is that an abortion that was deemed necessary based on reasonable medical judgment, which was intended to prevent the death of the pregnant female, and then, or that an abortion was due to a medical emergency. When you go back up into the definitions, and so this is where definitions are so important, right? Because they'll say what applies to certain words, but then you go back and read how the word's defined. A medical emergency means a condition that, in reasonable medical judgment, so complicates the medical condition of the pregnant woman that it necessitates an immediate abortion to prevent her death or substantial physical impairment of a major bodily function. Ready? Not including any psychological or emotional condition. A condition may not be deemed a medical emergency if based on a claim or diagnosis that the woman will engage in conduct that she intends to result in her death or in substantial and irreversible physical impairment of a major bodily function. So what does that mean for us? First of all, having rape or incest exceptions limited to a probable gestational age of a pregnancy of 6 weeks or less. Anyone who has tried to get pregnant, who has found themselves pregnant, who has had whatever experience knows that you can't even pee on a stick until you're 4 weeks along. And so the idea that 6 weeks somehow gives people, and I want to echo to what Amy has said, which is, we don't find any of these exceptions acceptable in terms of justifying the overall ban, but I'm just sort of trying to talk about it within the parameters of what I'm talking about, right? So if you come from the perspective that, abortion should be banned except in instances of rape or incest, even if that's your position, how is putting a 6-week limitation on that exception something that actually results in a usable exception? So it's this really disingenuous attempt to put on the books that there is an exception in these circumstances, but then effectively to put a limitation on it that makes it not an exception at all. And when you look at, so actually most countries in the world do contain rape or incest exceptions, either through explicitly containing those exceptions in their law or by allowing just broad elective access to abortion. But one of the things that I found really concerning and kind of preparing for today too is, I just want to read you this list. This is abortion bans in the US right now without exceptions for rape or incest. Idaho, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Arizona, Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Alabama, Florida, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Iowa. All those places. And so, you know, I think in our discussions with the committee, I mean, and those of you, when we do Q&A that were there with me can certainly provide your opinion, but there was no even real legitimate consideration or conversation about a meaningful exception for rape or incest. Just a complete and total disregard that someone who had gone through something like that would should be entitled to our laws to decide whether or not they want to carry a pregnancy. You know, one of the things that we tried to bring up in advocating with the committee, because you always have to think of creative ways to argue these things, is, you know, I had talked to a couple of senators and said, isn't there something, if your goal is to reduce the number of abortions, right? That's your goal, not just to like take policy positions that make you look like you oppose abortion, but you actually want to do it. Don't you think giving people who've experienced rape or incest more time to make that decision might actually be helpful to your cause, right? So how do we know that giving someone a longer period of time to consider their options wouldn't change their decision, right? And so again, I want to say all of this to say we're just taking aim at these things all the ways we can and trying to bring people around who otherwise aren't going to be brought around. But it's just an incredibly discouraging aspect, and I think really illuminating of how little the legislators care about women as individual people in our state, because they weren't even willing to have the conversation. The other conversation that they weren't willing to have, as Becky touched on in her experience, is if you find out that your pregnancy, even if you wish to carry it to term, will not, that your child will not survive for any extended period of time after birth. They were not even willing to really have the conversation about whether or not that should be an exception. So if you find out at 20 weeks along that your pregnancy has a condition that makes it incompatible with life outside the womb, and you wish to terminate and not carry to term, there was really no serious discussion about including an exception. The one thing that we observed, I think, was Senator Estenson saying, well, that's not what we're talking about here. And it's like, but we are. And I've seen that over and over and over again this session, is legislators saying, well, that's not what this means. And then me saying, with all due respect, I have a law degree. My job is to read these laws and look at, and what I try to stress too is, if there's multiple ways something can be argued legitimately, then you're in a problem area about whether or not what you're intending is actually what the law does. And there's just a total lack of respect for anybody that has any kind of expertise. And we saw that with the doctors. We saw that with advocates. I also think it's really important. I want to say this delicately because it's really difficult for a lot of people in spaces where they have state funding. But I think we also, as an advocacy community, need to examine the willingness to take the risk and stand up and speak about these things. It is difficult, but without the voices of people that work in these areas, we have an even harder time, I think, advocating for so many of the situations that people fall in these categories. And so just really making sure that, so we've talked a lot within our various groups about the need to really emphasize and keep working on organizing around these issues going forward, so that we continue to be ready to deal with these things in future legislative sessions. But so that's kind of the summary. I think overall, just the lack of exception on rape or incest, but then also the lack of exception and express statement that a woman's mental health does not matter and does not factor into the equation that medical emergencies cannot include someone being suicidal. Medical emergencies and well-being does not include mental health considerations. And what an absolute slap in the face that is to pregnant people in our state.
Christina, thank you very much for bringing those points forward. They're incredibly valid points that people need to be thinking about as this bill makes its way through the legislative session. I think particularly your point about the chilling effect that the anti-choice legislators and advocates have placed on people who are advocates in our community for victims of rape or incest and other issue areas, including physicians. They've been bullied almost into silence, and they've had their state funding, they feel, could be removed from them. And so I do think that's important to think about, like, who are the people pushing this legislation and what are they like and how do they treat other people? It's a pretty bad space to be in. I also wanted to lift up that ACOG has asserted that, we talk about exceptions. They really cannot create an entire list of medical exceptions that would be needed for women to have safe pregnancies, that it is actually dangerous to try to create a list of exceptions because it could never be comprehensive. So those are the medical professionals who help pregnant people. And I think it's important for us to be relying on actual medical professionals when we're thinking about these bills. Additionally, when we think about the rape or incest, a lack of an exception that this bill has, like you pointed out, like we're talking about re-victimizing victims at this point in time. And this could even be talking about re-victimizing children who are victims. So we need to be really thinking very thoroughly about what these bills mean to the people who are experiencing pregnancy and contemplating abortion. So thank you for lifting that up. So at this point in time, I'm going to actually transition to what we can all be doing in our communities. And I think it's pretty, I've seen a few comments in the chat, and I've seen some folks referencing it earlier today, but 10 years ago today, North Dakotans, many of you on this call, were standing together in solidarity against a personhood bill. That was a complete ban on abortion. There were people in all corners of the state rallying at the exact same time. It even made the Rachel Maddow show where she showed pictures of all of us across the state. It was a very powerful moment. And that energy continued forward. And it continued until it was on the ballot in 2014, where voters showed up and they defeated that abortion ban. And it was an abortion ban with no real exceptions, just like what we're kind of, in some ways, like what we're looking at right now. 2-1, voters rejected that. There is power in that. It was 10 years ago, and here we are again. But now we can maybe remind ourselves of that energy, re-engage new people in this movement, people who are now ready to take up on this fight. And so today we're going to listen to Katie Christensen. Katie is the North Dakota State Director for Planned Parenthood, and she began her career at Planned Parenthood leading sex education programs through a federally funded grant. In recent years, she's become more involved in advocacy, policy, and organizing. And if you have not taken a class from Katie, I suggest you sign up and do one. She is a phenomenal teacher, and she makes sex education accessible to children, to youth, and to adults, and also comfortable and fun. So if you haven't been able to take a class, please do find one from Katie. And Katie, I'm going to allow you to share what people can do to engage.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you very much for everybody for joining us. And I do want to just say again, thank you to Becky for continuously fighting and sharing your personal story. Like you mentioned, we do know that these bills impact real people in North Dakota, and a lot of people just don't feel comfortable speaking up because of the environment that has been created by our lawmakers in this state. So we thank you for continuously speaking up. So as we move through these potential actions that we can all take on this call, I want you to keep in mind that abortion is legal in North Dakota right now, and our lawmakers have the ability to keep it that way. But as has been highlighted throughout this call, they continuously push away that conversation, and they're not even willing to consider it. But we need to remind them that they can actually keep abortion safe and legal and accessible in North Dakota. So one of the first things that you can do is contact your legislators. Kayla is going to put a link in the chat. You can click on that right now and send an email to your legislators telling them to vote no on Senate Bill 2150. This is an action alert that comes from Prairie Action. I also want to share up here on the screen that Prairie Action is going to have 2 other events coming up soon. One that really focuses in on crisis pregnancy centers. These are anti-abortion organizations. They receive money from our state. Actually, right now, our state is going to put about $1.6 million into these organizations. You can learn more about them at this upcoming event. And then Prairie Action is also going to offer some information about self-managed abortion. And then Kayla will also put in the chat how you can subscribe to the Prairie Briefing to stay up to date on other events that are happening. Next, I want to share with you, these are some next steps from Planned Parenthood. We will be in Bismarck tomorrow from 1 to 3 p.m. doing a postcard writing event. Please join us at that event in Bismarck from 1 to 3 p.m. We will be at the Hub doing a postcard writing event to contact our legislators about this bill and a couple others. We also have an action alert where you can tell your North Dakota lawmakers to oppose these bills. And we encourage you to follow these other 3 organizations. The North Dakota Women's Network hosts something called Feminist First Friday. Their next event is on April 7th. It's the first Friday of the month, and they hold these events throughout the entire state. There are quite a few different locations. You can connect with this and connect with other individuals. You could take the information that you learned here today to the next Feminist First Friday and share that with other people in your local area. I also highly recommend following ACLU North Dakota and also the North Dakota Wind Fund. They provide frequent updates. If you're not familiar with North Dakota Wind Fund, they are an abortion access fund, which means that they raise money and then they use that money to support people who are trying to seek abortion. So for instance, if somebody needs help with gas money or with a hotel, they are there to help eliminate some of those barriers to try to get a person to where they need to be in order to access that care that they want. If you have any questions, you can please post them in the chat for us. I will say the last thing I want to add is that stories are very, very powerful. If you do have a story that you would like to share, please reach out to one of us on this panel and we can help you, whether that's connecting with legislators or maybe writing a letter to the editor or perhaps holding another event like this where you can include your voice. So thanks again for being here, and I'm going to turn things back over to Amy Jacobson.
All right, and I apologize, I didn't put myself on mute, so I hope everybody could hear clearly. Thank you, Katie, for bringing forward those opportunities. And I also would echo your statement about personal stories being so powerful. We did have a comment in the chat from a state legislator really asking people to reach out to their electeds and tell their stories, or just share your opposition to 2150. So thank you for lifting that up. At this time, we do have a few minutes remaining for questions. I think what the easiest thing may be to do is I put in the chat for anyone who has a question to raise their hand. I should be able to see it even if we're on spotlight, I think. So if you have a question for any of the panelists, please raise your hand now and I will look for it and then call on you. Or if one of the other panelists sees anybody's hand, I'm not sure. Oh, there we go. Robin, go ahead and take yourself off mute and ask your question.
I'm just reading Dina's question. Where's the hub?
Where is the hub? Katie?
I just put it in the chat. It's 321 South First Street in Bismarck. They do have a coffee shop. So my plan is to get us all caffeinated and energized so we can contact our legislators.
Thank you for that question. Does anybody else have a question they'd like to ask of Meetra while she's here with us today, or of any of the local advocates before we adjourn? I see Dina raising her hand. Dina, can you hold on? I'll see if I can unmute you.
Unmute. I was just trying to find my unmute. Is anything planned, and I hate to put it this way, but the inevitability of where this is going at the end of the session, Is there anything planned to send them home with a message, like some kind of a signy die uh, rally or anything like that?
Katie or Kayla?
Let's plan it.
We-
Let's do it.
So there's been conversations about doing exactly something like that around the LGBTQ plus issues, and I would assume that our partners in that space would be very willing to broaden the scope of those events. So I will bring that up for sure.
Amy, my hope in life is to go to jail for something, doing good while doing good. And that's on my bucket list. So if we need to shackle
Can we all touch the
ourselves to
railing?
Capitol, yeah,
We'll all
I'm
go
ready.
touch the railing and get pulled out of there.
Whatever it takes, call on me.
Dina, all of the jails are going to be full of librarians.
Oh, and I was on a library board. Good.
Thank you. Thank you for lifting that up, and we will see what we can do to make that happen. Just kidding. Any other, I thought I saw a question in the chat. I'm going to pull it up and see. And it was a question for Meetra. I think, Meetra, is there anything that we as North Dakotans can do to help you on your end?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am not sure, I am on our litigation team. I'm committed to, broadening access through the courts. I will defer to other folks in North Dakota if you can think of anything else, but, speaking up and sharing where you stand on things is always, helpful to show that there is broad support for abortion rights.
Thank you. I agree with that. And I think following the Red River Women's Clinic and the WIN Fund is also a good way to, kind of stay apprised. They're the first ones to share out what's happening with the center or happening with court cases. And so follow them on Facebook, and at least on Facebook. And I think they may have a listserv if you reach out to them that you can get information. Okay, we have 4 more minutes. So I see the top of my list here. I have Terry. Terry, do you have a question?
Actually, more of a comment, and I can't I can't turn on my camera. If I tell you I haven't brushed my teeth, that means I haven't done anything to myself today. But, and I realize that I feel a safe space, so I'm just going to let you know that the Cass County Dem NPL is planning a pretty aggressive media blitz to call attention to a lot of the misdeeds of the Republicans, including LGBTQ issues, library bans, etc. And we will be preparing to offer the things that we have prepared to the rest of the state, should they want to put some money together and use them as well. So it's not just about the horrible things they're doing to women. It's about the horrible things they're doing to everybody. And so just keep your eyes open or contact your local Dem NPL.
Thank you for that information, Terry. And I will take that opportunity to say that reproductive rights is not a partisan issue. And there are people on both sides of the political aisle that support access to abortion care. So whatever that Terry has going with her political party, if you have another political party, I would encourage you to try to do the same on this issue. So thank you for lifting that up. We have one more question we're going to take, and I see Karen Dunlap has her hand up. Can you unmute?
Hi, yeah, I wanted to ask, and I've asked this before, and I just don't know exactly how we would approach it. Who we need, obviously we've got smart lawyers on the call, so I'm hoping that they have thoughts about this, but a constitutional amendment to further guarantee bodily autonomy in the state, not just for reproductive freedoms, but for our LGBTQ friends and neighbors as well. What options are there? How do we get something like that going? How do we make sure the words that we use are the right words to give a broad enough guarantee of those kinds of freedoms that we want to make sure are enforced in our state?
Karen, thank you for bringing that question up. And I think it's a perfect question to kind of close out this call. I have a few thoughts, but I want to see if anybody else would want to chime in on that question about constitutional protections for abortion rights in North Dakota.
I think you should start us off, Amy.
Okay.
Go ahead.
And I know it can be complicated and we don't want to confuse. There are things happening in those several court cases right now that are moving through. So I don't think maybe it's a place for the center and others to comment on that, but I could be wrong. I think from my perspective as somebody who worked on the personhood ballot measure, it is something that we want to be very thoughtful of. So my suggestion would be to get us through this legislative session and then have some consultation with attorneys who work in this area to see what sort of things are could be at risk or at stake, and do some really good due diligence work ahead of any potential ballot measure. To note that then I would look to experts in the field. You really need to have a little bit of money so that you can do some research and find the right things to be saying, the right people to be involved. And also be paying attention to the legislature right now, because they are making it more difficult for people to move a constitutional amendment. So that's another thing that we'll be needing to take into consideration. So while there's no clear answers right now, I think it's a conversation to continue to be had. And so on that note, it is exactly 11 a.m. I want to thank all of you who attended this morning and made the time to spend with us to learn more about the court case, the court ruling, other court cases, the 2150, and how you can be engaged. And I really want to extend a sincere thank you to our panelists for being here today, for sharing your talent and your passion to defend reproductive rights in our state, sharing your personal stories, to connect with people across the state, and continuing to keep up the fight, because I know it's exhausting and we've referenced a couple of decades of work. So thank you all for doing that, and have a great rest of your weekend. Enjoy the sunshine. Take care.